Yeah, it has been almost a year ago since we met here in the same place, and that was the conclusion of the phase one that Kerry just talked about. And I think now this convention here aims at concluding what we have done in that almost 1 year that has passed. So since Kerry has already talked about what phase one was all about, I will only quickly touch on what we did in phase one, and that immediately turns into what we had to do or what we wanted to do to choose suitable models, goes into the phase one, the principles, what is now called ECPA OWB, the tool that we developed, and how we think or hope that this tool will be used by the co-formulant suppliers, followed by a short and crisp demonstration of the tool itself, and then questions and discussions on what I've said so far that can follow them. Okay, we were talking to crop protection folks in the beginning, so we need to tell them that there was basically a new kid on the block, which is called REACH, and even Article 15, deluded many people into thinking that REACH was not affecting crop protection. We now know that, or we know since more than a year now, that we had to do a substantial amount of work under REACH. So we needed to find out what are the REACH requirements for human safety assessment for co-formulants. Again, also looking at what are other industry sectors doing to fulfill their obligations under REACH. And of course the questions, are co-formulants covered by Directive 91414, which was not the case, as we now know. Following by the question, what models can we then use to assess human exposure to co-formulants? Then we were looking into what REACH or the guidance to REACH had to offer as far as human exposure models go. So there is the, just very quickly, the tier 1 models, Isotoc TRA, that many people know covers inhalation and dermal exposure and is based on EASE. Then there's a German model sponsored by the Bauer called EMKG. It's an Excel-based tool, covers inhalation exposure only. Then there are so-called tier 1 plus models, risk of derm, covers only dermal exposure. The Stoffen Manager is also a web-based tool, covers only inhalation exposure. And very recently there has been published some advanced REACH tool. It's pretty much a beefed up Stoffen Manager with some extra features. But if you look into these models and the interviews that you have to fill in to run these tools, you find out that they are not addressing anything that comes close to a crop protection application. It's all about industrial applications. So this is what the models are designed to do. And they will find widespread use by other industry sectors, and we are using them avidly to help our clients in manufacturing industry. But it's not quite right for our crop protection applications. So if we think about these typical crop protection applications, the people that have strolled through an agricultural area, this is what you basically see. You see basically mainly spray applications, and in preparation to the spray application you see somebody preparing a tank mix. And if we want to pick up the REACH language, we have to use descriptors. We are in the PROC area. This is going to be PROC 8A, transfer of a substance or preparation from or to a vessel, from this vessel into a large container at a non-dedicated facility. And this is, both of this here, the greenhouse application and the open field application, they will all fall under one PROC 11, non-industrial spraying. You can already tell that these applications are not really similar. You have here one handheld application and you have a tractor mounted application. This is supposed to be covered by a single PROC, so one can imagine that this will not work in practice. But nevertheless, since we have the PROCs, we can use TRA and use the standard model sponsored by ECHA. But TRA is really not made for being used with preparations. It's a tool that's pretty good for handling pure substances, then manufacture and filling and so forth. Maybe not the best in the world, but it's still, that's what it's designed to do. But if we're dealing with plant protection preparations, we are looking at two different mixtures that I handled. The first one that is actually sold to the farmer, that's a plant protection product concentrate. That may be solid or liquid. And then you have always an aqueous field dilution, which may be a dilution 1 to 200 or even more in water. But to run the TRA assessment, you need to know the concentration of the coformulant in both mixtures. It can be a challenging task to obtain for all the coformulants, all in the concentrated product, as well as what the gap that the good agricultural practice demands on how much water to be used in the field application. One thing that is a drawback for TRA when being used with liquid mixtures of dissolved substances is that the TRA will strongly overestimate exposure to vapors from these dissolved substances. And then also, TRA cannot account for protective clothing. Only RPE, respiratory protective equipment, is possible, but this is actually not a common type of personal protective equipment in crop protection field applications. But nonetheless, we can do it. We can just try and use a coformulant, a liquid coformulant, 100 grams per mole of low volatility, and it's 5% in the concentrated PPP, and it's diluted 100-fold to give the field dilution. And I just made up this example with rather benign DNLs, 10 mg per cubic meter and 10 mg per kg as a dermal DNL, just to give you an example. Now you feed that into TRA, and you get called the so-called linear report. And you can see why it's called the linear report, because it's basically a line, and you can't see anything. So I hope you can read it now, but basically it's Proc 8E, 8A, and Proc 11. In the public domain, outdoors. There's ventilation present, but only the natural ventilation given by the outdoor setting. The mixing and loading task, Proc 8A, is maximum duration smaller than 15 minutes. That's what it takes to do the tank mix. No respiratory protection used, and it's present in the preparation at 1 to 5. I think that's the lowest option you have. No, we have it here, 5%. So we're here. It's in the 5% preparation, and the actual spraying task takes all day. So it's greater than 4 hours. That's a default, no protection. And also now the preparation is dilute, 0.05. So we're here. So that's what you're getting out of it. We can probably just march through and find out what is the total margin of exposure. I think crop protection people will be puzzled by just the use margin of exposure, because normally you would want to have a margin of exposure as large as possible. That's what, NOEL divided by exposure, that's typically what we call a margin of exposure. And TRA uses this term as a substitute for the risk characterization ratio, which needs to be as small as possible. So this is just a wrong choice of words by TRA, and it could have been changed in the recent update, but it has not been changed. So it's still kind of using the wrong vocabulary here. Anyway, even with this little mixing and loading task for less than 15 minutes, you are greater than 1 here. Of course, you can use TRA or the output from TRA, the dermal exposure, and correct it for the 5% that's in here. So we would probably pass this assessment here, because the dermal margin of exposure would be corrected, or the dermal RCR to be more correct. So that can be corrected. And the spraying, which is this line here, gives you a very high inhalation estimate and also a very high dermal exposure estimate. And you're above for the inhalation RCR, and you're above 1 with the dermal RCR, leaving you a total RCR of 13.6. Again, you can reduce the dermal RCR by accounting for the 0.05. But remind you, this is not, you just don't use TRA, copy the table into your CSR and you're done. You have to do some hands-on work to correct the TRA to make it work for preparations. And that's not really what we were looking for. We could have, fiddled around with TRA so that you can use TRA and make it work for co-formulants. But you need a lot of information. You need the 5% value, you need this value, and then you have to use the output from TRA and manipulate it. That's not what we wanted. Because the answer was practically right before our eyes. We were using it for decades now, using established plant protection specific OPEX models, one of which is called the BBA model. That's the abbreviation for the German Biologische Bundesanstalt für Ackerbau. I think that's the term. It's also called the German model. It contains data for mixing and loading, as well as the application of liquid and solid plant protection products. And the thrilling thing, or what makes it especially useful, is that the only relevant input parameter that you use is the application rate, kilogram per hectare. And that's independent of the concentration in the concentrated product or in the field strength. All you need to know is how much of the substance will you be handling on a particular day, and this is basically gathered from this information. The model covers both handheld and tractor-mounted applications, so what we have seen in the previous slide. It's based on dosimetry data from the 1980s, which featured open tractors and high drift nozzles, so things that we would think are outdated now, and that also lead to pretty high-end exposure estimates. Thus, it's inherently and sufficiently conservative, and it has been used, as I said, for more than a decade in authorization of plant protection products. The geometric means, they are acceptable for registration of active substances in EU. So we thought that would be a good thing to use for co-formulants as well. This gives you a whiff of what the German model looks like. So this is obviously not a German model. This is just a sketch of a random person, a farmer, wearing all kinds of patches here on his headgear and the shoulder, upper arm, forearm, and gloves, and also all over the place. And here's a little pump and an absorbent tube, which is meant to sample the air within the breathing zone. And this has been done in a number of field studies that have been run by people donning all these patches. And so there was a huge database that can be analyzed for different types of applications, as I said, for handheld, for tractor-mounted, for different sorts of products, whether they are powder or granules or liquids. So there is a good database available. The drivers of operator exposure is, of course, you start with the physical state of the product. You have either a solid powder versus a liquid. And there are also, of course, granules, but from an exposure standpoint, the granules are pretty close to the liquid as far as accidental contamination goes. This physical state is only important during mixing and loading. So after you have prepared your tank mix, it's a liquid, and what it has been before, it's irrelevant from then on. Then you have, of course, handheld versus tractor mounted. Handheld, of course, you are in closer proximity to the emission source, whereas as tractor mounted, you are somewhere in the driving seat and you have behind you a tractor mounted spray boom. So this difference affects the exposure pattern, and it also affects the daily work rate and thus the amount of substance that you'll be handling. In a handheld application, you typically, and the model assumes that you'll be spraying on 1 hectare per day, which is still a huge workload. And in tractor-mounted applications, if you are in open field applications, then you're supposed to treat 20 hectares per day. So that's all inherent in the model. And then, of course, there's indoor versus outdoor, which becomes important when we handle volatile co-formulants.